All right, I'll go ahead and get started. So let's start by setting a positive motivation. So we can think that the purpose of our time is to find tools and techniques, ideas that we can begin to put into practice in our everyday lives to begin to more deeply familiarize the mind with virtue and to lessen the tendencies, the states of mind, the habits that we have that we find are painful for oneself when they arise, and that the actions that we engage in under the influence of such states tend to cause harm to those around us. So we can think about growing our innate potential for goodness and lessening those states of mind that we don't find constructive, and wanting to engage in this process so that we are of greater and greater benefit over time to other sentient beings. All right. So we said that we would start today talking about types of meditation. So we'll do that. Before we go into that, did anyone have any thoughts or questions from what we covered before? Nope. All right. So broadly speaking, when we talk about there being different types of meditation, we're referring to one of two different, hello, Susan, one of two different, really sort of modes of meditation. You could say types, but when we say types, and I mean, FPMT uses that word in this context, but it is the case that we combine these different, kind of really, I would say, modes. We're generally in one mode or we're in a different mode, but they aren't completely divorced sorts of things, or completely separate sorts of things. There's ways of joining the two modes. And in fact, there are times when it's absolutely necessary to join them within a single session of meditation. It's not necessary all the time, but there are times when it is. So these two modes are, we could say, analytical or stabilizing meditations, or modes of meditation. A stabilizing meditation is one in which the object of meditation can be generated without the use of concepts or words or thoughts. And an analytical meditation does require the use of concepts or words or thoughts in order to generate. So For example, if we are concentrating our awareness on the physical sensation of the breath, that is just a physical sensation that we generate. We do have to generate it. We do have to breathe. Hopefully, if we're meditating, we're breathing. But we don't have to think about an idea or a concept. We just have to create that physical sensation. But another, or we could take the body, for example, as the object. And in that sense, we really aren't generating anything. The body itself is just generating, because the body is either experiencing heat or pressure or cold or discomfort, or whatever is a movement of air in the room, and we're just noticing what arises in the body. So in that instance, we really don't even have to create it, but we do have to select it as an object. We have to decide that particular session of meditation is going to be a meditation using the body. We don't decide that kind of at some point during the session, or we don't just say, oh well, I've gotten tired of this object, so now I'll just decide to take the body as the object. We decide that prior to the beginning of any particular session of meditation, and for that entire session we stay with whatever our chosen object is, whether it's the breath or the body or an analytical object, what have you. And it's also, I'd say generally quite good to have an idea of how long that session's going to be, whether it's going to be, 5 minutes or 10 minutes, maybe 15. How a person progresses through the different, lengthening the sessions of meditation, that's a very personal process. I would say one definition that we gave of meditation is the ability to concentrate the mind on a chosen object, without distraction. That's one way of thinking about meditation. And we know that meditation, when we try it, that distraction arises again and again and again. But also, if we look at the historical teachings, they will tell us that if we stick with it and take it seriously and apply, effort, and have consistency and discipline, then those distractions will lessen over time. And eventually they will subside completely, and the mind has the capacity to just stay absorbed in the object, the chosen object. So that if that's, we could take, and whether or not that is a goal that we will reach in this lifetime, hard to say. But if not, then at least we're creating imprints in the mind that will carry over to future lives. And those imprints will be very helpful. We will pick those imprints back up, and they'll be beneficial in future lives. So it's still quite important then to have a systematic way of progressing through meditation. David Comito did a series earlier in the year on stages of meditation. That's on the YouTube channel if you want to have maybe a little bit more, slightly more in-depth kind of conversation on that topic. Yeah. So, but that's to say that how a person, chooses to go about that really does have to be, I would say, driven by a person's relationship to a really qualified teacher, in terms of getting feedback, in terms of but we do, of course, want to start with quite short sessions. And I would say, that you want to see signs of progress before, you don't want to just say, oh, well, it's been X amount of time. And so because it's been X amount of time, I will definitely add, minutes to my session. You really want that process to be driven by how concentrated the mind was. And it's a long process. So we start with short sessions and we may continue with short sessions for a long time. We can add sessions to the day. I would start with, me personally, I would start with that, starting with one session. So, the first thing that I would start with is consistency in terms of meditating once every day, and then meditating twice every day, and then meditating 3 times every day, or at least, once or twice every day if you're working, and then maybe 3 or more times on the days that you're not working, something like that. So I think the consistency and building the number of sessions is where to start before you consider lengthening the sessions. And I would say that lengthening the sessions should be driven by actual feedback in terms of how concentrated the mind genuinely is. Yeah. So that was kind of a long aside, but so to go back to these 2 modes of meditation, stabilizing and analytical, we may only do stabilizing, that's an option. But when we do analytical, we're actually doing both. We're doing some stabilizing and some analytical, meaning that we, for a time, are intentionally discursive. The mind is intentionally discursive because we're following a chain of reasoning or a chain of logic that is showing us some truth about a topic. We're analyzing a topic discursively in the mind, and then concentrating the mind on that without distraction. So, for example, what I mean is we might be meditating on patience, and so if we're meditating on patience, then we are perhaps analyzing the benefits of patience, the advantages of developing a mind that is patient. That might be one part of the meditation. And then we might be thinking about the disadvantages of anger. That's another part of the same, could be the same session, could be different sessions, could be the same session. And then we might think about ways, what does patience look like? What does, not retaliating in anger, what does that look like in our speech? What does that look like in the mind? What does that look like in our actions? That could be, again, the same session, or it could be a different session of meditation. And the goal of that would be, if we assume, let's say that, we're putting those all together in one session, the goal of that would be to demonstrate the importance of practicing patience. So then at the end of the session of meditation, after we've analyzed, it from this angle, from that angle, from a different angle, we've now generated an insight in the mind about the importance of and the benefits of and how to go about. So then we end the session with a few minutes of concentrating the mind on, I must practice patience. I must put these insights into practice in my daily life. And or if the session is just on the disadvantages, let's say, of anger, which is related to patience, then the insight would be that anger is really not advantageous, that anger is something to abandon. So thinking of it, and I always use the word visceral, to describe these insights, because these insights are not just purely kind of sterile or intellectual. They're really felt experiences. And so we, the insight that we generate, like, for example, in thinking about the disadvantages of anger, it's really like wanting to separate oneself in a strong way, in the same way that you might, if you were to think about the disadvantages of like drug use, of like hard, cocaine or methamphetamines, or you would see, oh, this really destroys people's lives, it kills people, it shortens people's lives, they become unable to work, and you would have that same really strong kind of almost repulsion to the idea of taking that kind of methamphetamine or cocaine or whatever it is, because you're so familiar with the harm that it causes, that you would just reject it in a very strong, visceral, felt, experiential way. And we're meant to really develop that same way of relating to something harmful like hatred or jealousy, or any of these kind of mental states that we're meant to discard. We're really meant to think about those in that same spontaneous, natural, visceral way, that we think about, you know, taking something that would really damage our body, our mind. Because anger, Buddhism would say that anger is that. Anger does damage, our mind and our body in that same sort of way. It's just harder to see without analyzing. Yeah. So in an analytical meditation, we actually combine the intentional discursiveness, where we're probing a body of knowledge, the body of knowledge coming from the Buddha, about the advantages of patience or the disadvantages of anger, or impermanence, or whatever it might be. We're intentionally going step by step, thinking about it in a careful way, but then we're arriving at a conclusion, and then we're holding our mind single-pointedly directed at that conclusion. And that's the stabilizing part of an analytical meditation. So an analytical meditation has a stabilizing aspect. A stabilizing meditation, it's, by itself, wouldn't have an analytical aspect. Any thoughts or questions about that? No, that's clear. So, yeah, so we can't do analytical meditation without stabilizing, without at some point trying to single pointedly, because the theory behind stabilizing is that it's possible, that the mind is capable of single pointedly being focused without distraction. Of course, that's not our present experience, but with repetition, with practice, with discipline, that's the direction that we move in. And a person is encouraged, a practitioner is encouraged to include sessions of purely stabilizing meditation in their general practice, their overall practice, because there's no intentional discursiveness if the object is just the breath or the object is just the body. You have unintentional discursiveness, you have distractions that arise unbidden in the mind, because that's what the mind does. The mind thinks, but you're not intentionally causing discursiveness in the same way that you do when you're analyzing a topic, when you're thinking about impermanence, or you're thinking about the advantages or disadvantages of this or that. That is an intentional discursiveness of the mind, meaning that the mind isn't, you're thinking about this, and now this, and now this, and now this. The mind is moving to a succession of different objects. Whereas if it's just the physical sensation of the air in one location of the body, then that sensation over time, it becomes more subtle, or it changes, but the object is whatever is arising at that moment, and at that moment it is whatever it is. So it is just one thing at the time that you're observing it. It doesn't, it changes over time, but during the moment of observation, it's just the one thing. Any thoughts or questions?
Venerable Dondrub, I have a question. So what are some of the main objects of analytical meditation?
So in our tradition, in the Tibetan tradition, where those come from, generally speaking, is what's called the Lumrim. That's where a person gets the overwhelming majority of those topics. That's what Tibetan Buddhist practitioners, that's sort of like, not the Buddhist, I mean, it might be the closest thing, to thinking about, like, from a meditational standpoint, like the Buddhist Bible, in terms of like just meditational objects. There's a much wider corpus of material also, but it's all been condensed, you could say. All of the essential aspects of everything that the Buddha taught have been condensed into the Lumrim, which is Lamrim, Lumrim, or in English, Stages of the Path to Enlightenment. And it's 14, 15 major topics. And then from those major topics, you can certainly create a fairly larger number of individual sessions of meditations. Because again, you might decide to just do the advantages of something or the disadvantages of something in its own session. So, from that body of knowledge, you can kind of go about it in different ways in terms of creating individual sessions. And even the Lumrim itself is quite broad. There are many different teachers who have written treatises on the Lumrim historically. They vary in their complexity and their depth in what they're trying to accomplish. The seminal Lumrim text in our tradition is the great treatise, the Lumrim Chenmo by Lama Sukampa. It's a 3-volume, in English, it's a 3-volume work. It has many, many citations. It's kind of the scholarly Lumrim, because again, there's a great many citations where Lama Tsongkhapa is quoting, this sutra, that sutra, this commentary, that commentary, to really show where all of the information is coming from. There's a shorter work called the Middle Length Lumrim, also by Lama Tsongkhapa. And again, this is coming from our tradition, the Gelug tradition. Other traditions are going to have different teachers that they really focus on. That I would say is more so like the meditator's Lumrim, the Lumrim, the middle length Lumrim. It covers, of course, it covers all of the same material, but it doesn't have all of the same. It's shorter, it's just one volume, and it's about maybe 300 pages, 400 pages, whereas the Lumrim Chenmo is like over 1,000 pages. So really what he did in the middle length Lumrim is omit a lot of those citations, a lot of the more scholarly, there's a lot less of that in the middle length Lumrim. So covers all of the same material, but doesn't give as much of all of the quotations. I think the Lumrim Chenmo is something that people study eventually. It's kind of inescapable. And I think it is quite helpful even in meditation, because sometimes you'll find when you are meditating on, you'll find that a particular citation kind of, comes to you in that meditate and like helps you, so not like in a mystical way, but just, you studied it. And so I do think that it's helpful to study both. And yeah, FPMT encourages, and that's just sort of the approach is to study both. I can't tell you like in what order, to do that. I'm not a teacher, so I can't, I don't know that I can be helpful in terms of how to, go about it. But FPMT has courses, on both, where yeah, so they're both really helpful, kind of in slightly different ways. Yeah, and next month in the Buddhism in a Nutshell class, there's most of those sessions are guided by a very, very short text by Lama Sukampa, which is what's called a glance meditation on the Lumrim, where it's called the Foundation of All Good Qualities is the name of that particular text. It's like a 2-3 page text, where again he covers all of the 15 topics, but he does it in one stanza each. And that's not meant for study, that's meant to remind you of what you have studied. So people study the middle length Lumrim or the Great Treatise or both, but then they might recite the Foundation of All Good Qualities every day to kind of help them to move through everything that they have studied, kind of as a refresher, as a way of like, you can very quickly get a sense of how all of the pieces fit together, with something like the Foundation of All Good Qualities or Lines of Experience, these really, really short Lumrim texts. Yeah. And then, there's in that class, we'll talk about how the Lumrim comes from Atisha, and Geshe-la is doing on Sundays. He just started teaching the foundational text of Lumrim, which is Lamp for the Path by Atisha. That's where all of the later Lumrims come from. They're all further commentaries or deeper explanations on Lama Atisha kind of started this whole effort with Lamp for the Path. So the Sunday class is, also a great thing, and much greater than next month's class because it's Geshe-la. So that's what if you're really interested in that, and those classes are also on our YouTube. So if you've missed, the first few, they're there.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So then we could say that we can also talk, and this is kind of a more subtle point, but we could talk about how we're meant to, this is in relation to analytical topics. We can, in a way, we can further subdivide analytical meditation in terms of how, like you could say what it's meant to do, or how we're meant to actually relate to that object. So I gave, I mean, and maybe in a way I've touched on it, but we could say that there's two ways of relating to analytical objects. With something like impermanence, the definition of the word impermanence in Buddhism is that which changes moment by moment by moment. It doesn't imply that something ceases, meaning that it no longer will exist. That often, in terms of what we experience on earth, Buddhism would say that almost everything that we experience is a compounded phenomena, and compounded phenomena are impermanent. And almost all of those, it's true that they will cease, that they will stop performing their function, and we no longer think of them as as what we call them. When your computer stops functioning, you don't say, oh, that's my computer. You say, oh, that's a broken computer. Or you might say, oh, that's trash now, I have to just recycle that, take that to the electronic recycling place, and they'll turn it into something else because it no longer performs the function that we expect of computers. So it's no longer that. But the word impermanence itself doesn't actually imply that. It just implies that the object changes moment by moment by moment. Because, for example, the mind changes moment by moment by moment, but it's never anything other than mind. Mind never ceases, it never becomes something else. We can say that it can move from ordinary mind to enlightened mind, but it's still in the nature of clarity and awareness. It's still, the mind itself is still just clarity and awareness, either way. It just functions a bit differently when it becomes enlightened mind rather than ordinary mind. But again, it's kind of a long aside to just say, when we meditate on something like impermanence, the goal is to understand something about how the world is. The world, almost everything in the world is characterized by impermanence. And when we meditate on impermanence, we're trying to become wiser about how the world works. When we meditate, though, on something like compassion, we can't say that the world is characterized by compassion, or that the world is in the nature of compassion. We can say that the Buddha encourages us to become more compassionate, and that it's a good thing to be more compassionate. So the goal of meditating on compassion is to do that, is to actually embody compassion, not to. So I mean, in a way, we try to understand what it means, how it differs from attachment. We have to get clear on the meaning, but really the goal is to embody it. The goal is to make the mind in the nature of compassion, because it serves a useful purpose. It brings us closer. If we've taken enlightenment as our end goal, and we have confidence in the Buddha is saying that embodying compassion will bring us closer to that end goal. And so they're both analytical meditations, but on the one hand, we're trying to either become you could say more intelligent or wiser about how things work, or you could say we're trying to actually embody something that the mind itself is trying, we're not trying to embody impermanence, but we are trying to embody compassion. Um, so there's different ways, depending on the nature of the analytical object, the goal of the meditation can be different in terms of whether it's to become smarter or wiser, or to actually embody it. So in a way, that's just a subtler way of thinking about analytical meditation. Any thoughts or questions? Nope. Okay. So now we'll talk about obstacles to meditation and what we can do, some antidotes to those obstacles. So there's five that we'll talk about, five kind of historical obstacles. And the first is called laziness. And laziness is basically just not starting a meditation practice. It is the mind that finds it difficult to want to meditate. It's the mind that finds other things to do with one's time. It's sort of the trouble that we have getting into developing that consistency of meditating. And Buddhism would say that busyness, usually we think of laziness as kind of a lethargy, kind of a sleepiness, or but Buddhism would say that a person can be quite active. A person can spend a lot of time pursuing things. And, so Buddhism would actually say that like a high-powered attorney or CEO, from a worldly perspective, we're encouraged to really think of that person as, a go-getter, as, driven. But Buddhism would, the Buddhist view would be, if that person is using those pursuits of trying to understand the law, or get more money or whatever, if they're saying, well, I don't have time to meditate because I work 80 hours a week in my law firm, Buddhism would say that's actually a form of laziness, because it is not adopting what's truly beneficial, because that person's going to die. And whether they had become, the CEO of their company, or they had, become partner in their law firm or not, that's kind of a silly goal to take. And you might be really motivated and really directed to achieve that goal, but Buddhism would say, well, that goal isn't particularly useful. And even, even if it is kind of a useful goal, but in a kind of mundane way, for example, a doctor might be really genuinely motivated to alleviate the suffering of disease. And that's a wonderful goal. And it's certainly much better than just trying to amass wealth, or to be thought of, to get a certain status in society. But Buddhism would say, well, still, you are going to die, and everyone that you have helped to not get cancer is still going to die. Even though you've helped them not get cancer, they're going to die of something else. And so still spiritual growth is a better goal than, um, than even prolonging people's lives through medicine. It's comparatively a wonderful goal to have, but if it prevents a person, historical Buddhism would assert that the greatest thing that we can do is to achieve enlightenment. And if we are prevented from that by following other things, then that is a form of laziness. Um, so it's really anything that gets in the way of a consistent, stable practice. And then the next is called forgetfulness. And this is when we are meditating, but it's just that there's a lot of distraction that's arising in the mind. So we have a chosen object for all of our sessions, but as we're meditating, and this is not abnormal, none of these are abnormal. All meditators have to deal with all of these, have to overcome all of these. They're all completely, it's not like we're a terrible person because we have laziness or forgetfulness or any of these. This is what for 2,600 years, these are part of the human condition, but they have to be understood and overcome in order to progress in enlightenment, to make spiritual progress. So this is really just the fact that distractions arise in the mind, as we know that they do. So, but the antidote to forgetfulness is kind of not helpful in and of itself, because it's just called recollection. It's just called recollecting the object. And of course, but it also means developing mindfulness, developing introspective awareness. What it means is returning back again and again and again to the chosen object. And what this is getting at is that concentration is a mental muscle, or it's a habit or a tendency or a capacity of the mind that we have to train in slowly over time, and that there's really nothing magical about how to do it, that we have a chosen object, distraction arises, but we have to notice the distraction and move the mind back to the object again and again and again. We can't just indulge in distraction. If we indulge in distraction, and of course, it's at the very beginning, it's quite difficult. We find ourselves having been distracted for several minutes before we notice it. But the goal is to notice quicker and quicker and move the mind back, more and more immediately after the mind has moved off of the object. If we don't do any of that, if we don't apply ourselves at all, then we're not really meditating seriously. We're not really, taking it seriously. We do have to move the mind back to the object, and then try to kind of sharpen our attention, or, make some effort to stick the mind or hold the mind once it's on the object, until the next distraction arises. And then, so it's this never-ending process of just going through these steps again and again and again and again. So then the next obstacle is a pair of obstacles, which is laxity and dullness. I'm sorry, laxity and excitement, or dullness and excitement. So mental, also called like mental sinking, or excitement, different words getting at the same two ends of the same spectrum. Either the mind can be tending toward drowsiness, tending toward sleepiness, tending toward kind of a heaviness, or the mind is very bright, the mind is very kind of ping-ponging here and there. The mind is just flitting from one thing to the other. These are two parts of the spectrum. What we want is for the mind to be kind of in the middle. We want for the mind to have enough brightness to remain on the object, but we also want the mind to be grounded enough that the mind isn't just going off onto object after object after object. So we want the mind to be kind of right between these two extremes, relatively speaking. Yeah, so we want to avoid agitation or dullness or excitement or sinking. Any thoughts or questions so far? So in general, when we're talking about excitement or dullness, the first antidote, the antidote that applies to both, is vigilance. It's noticing, again, this comes back to introspective awareness, mindfulness, being able to notice, is there dullness or is there excitement? Am I tending toward drowsiness and dullness, or am I tending toward excitation? And then in the same way, also really being, wanting to do something about it. So, and again, excitation is marked by kind of a slew of distractions, whereas dullness is kind of more of a sleepy, tired, heavy mind. There might not be so many different distractions in the mind, but the mind just kind of is sort of stuck in the mud, kind of. You just sort of can't really stay on the object. So with excitation, what we want to do is kind of tighten the mind. We want to bring the mind down a little bit. We want to rein it in. When the mind is too bright, we want to pull it back. So we want to sharpen our focus a little bit, and to pull back this energy. So one way of doing that is literally to just sort of have the sense of grasping a little bit more strongly on the object, kind of having a sense of, in the same way that when you're trying to read a book and there's people talking, and it's like really important that you absorb, you have this sense of like narrowing down, of like tightening down, and you have to be, cautious of that. You don't want to do it too much, because then you can also get fatigued. That can cause kind of a strain. You don't want to feel a strain in the mind, but you want to just kind of play around. So this is another aspect where it's important to maintain. Of course, when we meditate, we take it seriously, and we keep our sessions short. We have good, we really try to keep the posture, and we have good hygiene, with all of these habits. But we also want to maintain a sense of playfulness, with it too, a lightness, where we don't take it quite so, we're like, oh, I have to do this. We need to think, oh, I get to do this. This is something that, is joyful. So when this idea of tightening the mind, that can become kind of like a strain, and it can be a little bit unpleasant. So we have to work with it too, and so it doesn't become like that. And that's just sort of experiential, and you just sort of have to, if you find yourself fatiguing, then you really have to think about it. Are my sessions too long? Or do I have too many sessions? Am I meditating at the wrong time of day? You have to kind of just play around with that, so that because there's a real danger of having an adverse, reaction to meditation. And like, um, if you start to associate it with those feelings of fatigue, and then you'll start to go into laziness, and it'll be even harder to really get going. Another thing that they suggest is, if you're just finding that there's a lot of excitation, then when that session ends, and maybe you're going to do more in a little bit, or you're going to do, then maybe doing a short contemplation on a sobering topic like death, or one's own mortality, to kind of be like, and again, not to be morbid, but to kind of remind yourself that this is important, and why you're doing it, and that time is short, and that this is important. Questions, thoughts? Nope. Okay. And then another technique is because again, excitation, this technique has to do with the fact that excitation kind of, in terms of the energies of the body and mind, is kind of a very exuberant sort of energy. So they say if you focus on like a dot or a seed, kind of like like inside the body at the level of the navel, kind of thinking about, like a small dot inside the body at the level of the navel for, just a few minutes, maybe before you meditate, if the mind feels kind of distracted, and the 9-round breathing is, that we talked about, that can be helpful too for either of these, just kind of stabilizing the energies. But to spend a couple of minutes concentrating the mind, because that will actually lower where the mind, that will kind of bring the mind down to the lower chakras, which will counteract this kind of really bright mind that's happening. But then on the other end of the spectrum, we have dullness that happens, which again is this tired, heavy mind that occurs, or laxity, where really the mind, it could, in the extreme form, it's a tendency to want to go to sleep, to find it just hard to stay awake in meditation. And so here, again, thinking about the posture can be, because if we have kind of a slouched or humped over or slouched, or just kind of a willy-nilly sort of posture, that can tend toward drowsiness, if the spine isn't upright. Another thing to think about is how much light is in the room. If we're meditating in a relatively dark room and our eyes are, quite tightly shut, then that can be an obstacle that can move us toward drowsiness. So raising the amount of light, or opening our eyes a bit more. And then the other energetic contemplation is thinking about a ball of light, kind of, and raising it from the level of the chest up to the top of the back of the head, and visualizing kind of shooting it up into the air, for a few minutes, doing that for maybe 2-3 minutes of this small ball of light beginning at the heart, the level of the heart, and shooting it up through the top of the back of the head. That can kind of raise, just like before we were trying to lower our energy by contemplating, like a small dot at the navel. Here we're starting at the heart and bringing that energy up, and that can kind of raise our energy level. Other things that we can do is a little bit before we meditate, maybe a little bit of light exercise. Going outside, doing a little bit of walking, or, a little bit of jogging in place, not anything to where you're sweating or anything like that, but just to where you've kind of shaken off your lethargy by raising your heart just a little bit. Just a little bit of light exercise can be helpful. Not stopping your session and doing that, but maybe before your session, if you're like, oh, I'm going to go into this with a heavy mind.
Venerable, what about procrastination? Where does that fit in? Is that a
That would
form
be
of laziness?
Yeah, that would just be laziness. Yeah, just another way of.
Because it's like you're willfully sabotaging yourself
Yeah.
when you do that.
Any other questions?
So, yes, I have a question. Was that the 5? We have laziness, forgetfulness, laxity, and excitement, and then dullness and no, we're only 3, right?
Sorry. So the 5 are excitement and dullness, forgetting the object, laziness. Yeah, so those are the 5. Laziness, forgetfulness, excitement and dullness. And then, sorry, the 5th is non-application or over-application. So that's the 5th. The 5th is also a pair, so non-application, non-application is when we should be applying so the 4th and 5th is non-application or over-application, which is confusing because the last 2 were also 2, but so it's a little bit confusing. So non-application is that there's something going wrong in the meditation, but we're not taking it seriously enough, like laziness. Laziness is arising, but we're not doing anything about laziness, or forgetfulness is arising, but we're just not doing anything, or excitement or dullness, they're arising, and we're just kind of okay with one of the previous faults arising, and we're not making any effort to do anything about it. And that's of course, that's for us, that's the main, in terms of these 2, that's the one that we really have to think about, because that's, that is going to happen to us a lot. The next one, over application, really is kind of only for more advanced practitioners. It doesn't really happen. It really doesn't happen much for us, but it does happen to people who are very good at meditating. They're what they say is that they're so used to obstacles arising that when they don't arise, they might still think that they're arising, and they apply a strong antidote that's not necessary. So there comes to be a point where they've progressed beyond the coarser obstacles, but there might be really, really subtle obstacles that might require just a very slight intervention. But because for most of their sort of meditative history, they had been applying stronger antidotes, the mind kind of goes to, and what they say is that the strong antidote, when there's a weak obstacle arising, applying a strong antidote actually makes things worse. It takes, it's more skillful to just do a slight correction. But again, that only applies to people who have really developed a very high level of meditative skill. They are in danger of over application. Whereas for us, it's non-application that we're in danger of.
But are they being delusional by doing that?
Well, they're ordinary sentient beings. And so Buddhism would say that all ordinary sentient beings are operating under the influence of delusion. They haven't realized emptiness directly. And, it's a misconception in the mind that's occurring due to the force of habit. So I would just sort of say that it's that there's a strong prior habit that doesn't serve that person anymore, and and they're just kind of in that groove of this is what I needed to do, and now I need to do something different, but I'm just not used to that yet.
Did you say the antidote for that? Then what is the antidote? How do they counter that?
Yeah, so for non-application, the antidote is to the antidote to non-application is application, is is really reminding ourselves of why we're doing it. For over application, ultimately you just have to pull it back. You have to learn to reduce the level. And so it's also a function, they're really both functions of vigilance or introspective awareness, because when we aren't vigilant, when we're just sort of if a meditation is just sort of daydreaming and we're not applying the antidotes, then the solution is taking it seriously and really, giving yourself the instruction when a distraction arises. I'm going to notice the distraction and I'm going to bring my mind back. And so with over application, I don't have any direct experience with over application, so it's hard for me to, talk about it in the same way. But you would try, through working with your teacher and trying to understand where you are, you would try to recognize that the application is actually disturbing the mind, that rather than helping you to focus, the application is creating additional turbulence in the mind. You're not, before, when dullness was arising and you corrected the dullness, you actually focused better. And so it was useful. When there isn't really dullness, but you're applying an antidote to dullness, you're adding turbulence to the mind, you're adding brightness that doesn't need to be there. And now your mind is more buoyant than it needs to be. And so you just have to notice that you were wrong, that like it didn't actually help you to stay on the object. You've introduced unnecessary turbulence in the mind. Which again is really, but again, that's a function of introspective awareness also. So it's just this tool of developing real vigilance, real introspective awareness.
Thank you.
So those are the 5 kind of historical obstacles to meditation that they talk about in, the sutras. But we can also talk about 5 negative mental states that cause, and these really, I would say that these are things that are what motivate the arising of distraction. Because when we meditate, we don't find that we think about like the pencil on our table, like we don't obsess over the pencil on our table, and we can't just like, we can't get that out of our mind. That's not the kind of object that arises in meditation that takes us away from the intended object. The kinds of objects that arise are, pleasant objects, unpleasant objects, these different things that, or, yeah, and so we'll go into these mental states that, of course, we have and all sentient beings have, but they serve to empower the arising of distraction in meditation, because the things that distract us in meditation tend to be very emotionally kind of charged objects, not just sort of very plain vanilla kind of neutral things. They tend to be very impactful emotional objects. So the first is called attachment. The first of these negative mental states is called attachment. An attachment is a mind that observes an object that a person believes to be a pleasant object. So for whatever reason, could be their upbringing, their past history, their preferences, their personality. They look at an object and it appears pleasant to them. Some people like chocolate, some people don't like chocolate. So, the object itself isn't, there's no such thing as a universal object of attachment. It has to do with what that person views as pleasant or unpleasant. And that comes from their past experiences and their culture and so on. But for whatever reason, for that person, and we all have, objects of attachment, could be clothing, or it could be an actual person, or it could be vacations, or it could be wealth, or, we all have these things that we for us serve as objects of attachment. And what Buddhism would say is that when we tend, that as ordinary sentient beings, when we observe something that's pleasant, we tend to focus on the aspects of it that we believe give it its pleasantness. So when we think about chocolate, we think about the actual taste in the mouth, just, while it's touching the tongue. We don't think about the fat content. We don't think about the links to heart disease and diabetes and cancer. And, so it isn't to say that we can't have chocolate at all, but if we're, to the extent to which we feel like we need chocolate as part of our routine, as part of our day, part of our week, Buddhism would say that we've exaggerated the object by focusing exclusively on the one part of it that we like, and we discount the other parts of it. We don't think about the other. We don't have a realistic or holistic view of the object. And these types of objects do often arise in meditation. We often think about food, or a person that we are attracted to, or the beach, or a vacation, some kind of pleasant situation or circumstance that we would, we think, oh, I would, if I could just do this, then I would be happy. So what Buddhism is pointing out is that this mental state, the degree to which it exists unchecked in the mind, is the degree to which objects of attachment will arise when we try to meditate, that they will serve as distracting objects for us. And then the next is anger.
Wait a
Yep.
minute. Could
Yep,
you
yep.
say that again? The mental state. What? It was so good and so fast.
So the extent to which attachment as a state of mind is unchecked or unopposed in the mind, the more that we indulge in this exaggerated process, then objects of attachment will arise when we try to concentrate the mind, that the mind will naturally gravitate toward, being obsessed with food or, whatever it is that we find pleasant, if we're not actively trying to tame that tendency in the mind, that way of exaggerating. Because Buddhism would say that it's naturally an exaggerated mind. It's not looking at the object and saying, well, yeah, this object has some pleasant qualities, but it also has some unpleasant qualities. And so, realistically, I should have a really balanced view of it. I should have, maybe it's okay to have chocolate sometimes, but if I think that I will, be sad if I don't have chocolate, or that, if I come home and the chocolate that's in the refrigerator was eaten by somebody else, that necessarily, anger or frustration will arise. Buddhism would say that those are signs that we don't have a realistic appraisal of the object. And if we don't do anything about that, then we will find that these are the kinds of objects that are distracting us again and again. So then anger is another of these negative mental states. And it's a huge topic that we really don't have time to go into, this idea of anger, because it's also translated as hatred. And of course, we know that anger and hatred, in English, anger and hatred are very different things. So what anger means definitionally in Buddhism is that there's a wish to cause harm that comes along with it. So, but it's a huge topic, of course. But this idea, it's certainly an ill will. It's feeling that something is other than one would like it to be, and that the person that we think is responsible for causing that needs to be harmed in some way. I mean, not necessarily killed, but like verbally, harmed, or, some kind of retaliatory response needs to occur to the object that we think is causing the situation. So someone cuts us off in traffic, and rather than just kind of moving on, we want to honk the horn, we want to roll down the window and say an angry, word to them. That's kind of, it isn't just like, we can't just accept what happened. We actually feel the need to retaliate or do something back to that person. So again, this is a very common part of our mind. This is something that we all grapple with. But we've all had the experience in meditation, certainly, that just like objects of attachment, when people say unkind things to us, when we try to meditate, we're like, oh, how dare they say that? I can't believe that. When I see them again, this is what I'm going to do. This is how this is how I'm going to get back at them. These are the kinds of stories that play in the mind when anger is quite a prevalent part of the mind. Any so the larger question of is anger ever beneficial, or I mean there's sort of parts of that that are really hard to unpack in a class like this, but Buddhism would say that wanting to harm others is not beneficial, that certainly if we see injustice and we're motivated to do something about injustice, that's beneficial. But if we think that the best way to do that is to kill the people that are creating the injustice rather than finding a constructive solution, to the problem, Buddhism would encourage us to find, really cooperative and constructive solutions rather than just saying, oh, well, kill all of the bad people, so, and like attachment Buddhism would encourage us to find ways of reducing this sort of baseline tendency in our mind to want to respond to harm with harm. Okay, so the next negative mental state is diluted pride. So it's called diluted pride because it's not the same thing as, kind of feeling good about one's own positive qualities, taking, feeling, if one has a particular competency and one feels happy about that, or one feels like that's useful, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But if diluted pride refers to comparing oneself with others and thinking that because one may or may not have a particular skill or ability or quality, then that puts a person above other people, that a person is better than others because of the existence of a particular trait or quality or ability, then that is, and of course it's also true that we might think we have an ability or a skill that we don't have. Some people think that they're really good singers, and they go on shows or whatever, and people are like, you can't sing at all. So we also might just be mistaken. So there's also an extent to which we need to think about humility in the sense of, well, we might be just over exaggerating our own qualities. But even if everybody agrees that we are an excellent accountant or we're really good at math, we know, or whatever it might be, that is not, Buddhism would say that's not a valid basis for thinking that you're better than any other person. And that when we engage in that comparison, we've moved into diluted pride. And diluted pride is a real obstacle for spiritual growth. Okay. And then envy is the next. So envy is kind of the opposite of a mind that rejoices. It is a mind, envy is a mind that feels unhappy at the good fortune of some other person. So when, and often it could be, it could be a person that we don't like, But it could also just be a kind of a greedy mind, in a way, a mind that wants oneself to have experienced, even if it's our best friend, they might get a new car or a promotion. And the mind has a hard time just experiencing joy for their good fortune. The mind is like, why didn't that happen to me? I why didn't I experience that promotion? Or why don't I have that kind of, brand new car? So it's a tight, unhappy mind that is unable to feel any kind of joy at the good fortune of, could be any others, or in particular instances. Yeah. And again, this is something, these are all things Buddhism would say, that these mental states, they give rise to rumination, they give rise to, these conceptual stories that make it difficult to meditate. Because if we find out that some good thing happened to someone on a particular day, and the mind is not acquainted with rejoicing, we don't find that to be a natural habit that we have, because we just haven't developed it yet. We've practiced envy for a long period of time. Buddhism would say not just in this life, but countless past lives. It's easier, perhaps, to practice envy than it is to practice rejoicing. So we're really good at it, and it comes naturally to the mind. Then when we try to quiet the mind, then this thing that we're ruminating on will pop up, and it'll become an obstacle. So again, the antidote would be to learn to make rejoicing kind of our baseline state to the best of our ability to, because it didn't happen to us. We didn't get a new car, we didn't get a promotion, and so feeling unhappy about it doesn't serve any useful purpose. It already happened to that other person, so just feeling happy for them is the only, reasonable thing. It's outside of our control. And so, and what we notice too is that, as I mentioned at the when we were doing the motivation, all of these negative mental states are painful when they arise. They're painful for oneself. So the envious mind, the jealous mind, is, when it arises, it causes a tight constricting, of the heart. It's quite uncomfortable when it arises, just like anger and just like attachment. They're quite unpleasant to experience. Whereas a joyful mind is quite blissful, to experience. Which is how we know we can just, as I mentioned in the earlier class, how Buddhism distinguishes from constructive and destructive states subjectively, whether they give rise to contentment or whether they give rise to pain.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Why is it that the mind seems to gravitate to these negative states equally, if not more, than it does to clarity? And so clarity is, if that is the true nature of the mind, why does the mind go off all the time like this, into attachment, anger,
Mm-hmm.
envy, these kind of painful conditions?
So Buddhism would say that the next mental state that we're going to talk about really is the reason, and that's called fundamental ignorance, or Malrigpa, fundamental ignorance, which is the fifth of these five mental states. And ignorance pervades all of the negative mental states, and unfortunately it also pervades the positive mental states for an ordinary sentient being. An ordinary sentient being doesn't have any mental states that are not pervaded by ignorance, whether they're positive or negative. But the, only a fully enlightened being is completely devoid of this at all times. When a person sees it directly in meditation, then they are no longer an ordinary sentient being, they become an arhat. And these delusions don't arise, but they only don't arise in meditative equipoise on emptiness. They arise in daily life to one degree or another after that person arises from meditation. So it's only a fully enlightened being who's fully devoid of all afflicted states. So the mind is in the nature of clarity and awareness, but it arises together with fundamental ignorance until fundamental ignorance is overcome. So even when we're experiencing love or compassion as an ordinary sentient being, we're still mistaken about the nature of love or compassion. It's still qualified or marked, unfortunately, but still, I mean, comparatively speaking, love conditioned by ignorance is much better than hatred directly caused by ignorance. But still, a person who's experiencing love still is mistaken about the nature of their own reality, about the nature of the reality of the object for whom they're experiencing love. So it's still marked by fundamental ignorance. But yeah, it's kind of because of the existence of fundamental ignorance, we kind of have the path of least resistance in the mind. We, all of these, jealousy and hatred and, these are kind of comparatively, because essentially it comes down to, on the basis of fundamental ignorance, we tell ourselves that we're the center of the universe, that we are at the center of everything that is important. And when we have a need or a thought or a preference, it is the most important need or thought or preference. And if it conflicts with someone else's need or thought or preference, we will take priority over that other person. And as long as that is true, as long as we think of ourselves, and that's not to say that we're monsters, that's not to say that there's anything abnormal about that. That's the existential condition of all ordinary sentient beings, is to place themselves in the center of their own conceptual story. It's totally understandable and reasonable, but it has to be overcome if we want to achieve enlightenment. Unless and until we do that, we will always find it easier to want to possess the things that we think are pleasant, to want to push away the things that we think are unpleasant, to get angry when we can't push away the things that are unpleasant, to get, to want what other people have that we think is pleasant, that we don't possess, so all of these things, they're all empowered by the mistaken view of putting ourselves at the center of the universe. And that is the result of fundamental ignorance, an active misunderstanding of how we exist, what it means to have identity, what it means to have an I, to have a separate sense of individual personhood. So it's a huge, I mean, that's ultimately, and so, I mean, the good news with all of these is that because they're all empowered by fundamental ignorance, it isn't ultimately necessary to overcome, because the antidotes to, as we looked at, the antidotes to pridefulness are different than the antidotes to jealousy, which are different than the antidotes to anger, which are different than the antidotes to attachment. All of those distinct negative states of mind have specific opposing other states of mind, but they're not useful. The antidote to attachment isn't useful when pridefulness is arising and so on. But overcoming fundamental ignorance overcomes all of the negative mental states completely, which is the good news.
Thank you.
So it becomes necessary to, in daily life, of course, we find ourselves caught up in anger, in attachment, in jealousy at different times. And so at that particular moment, it's useful to apply the correct antidote to when attachment is arising, to remember, to create a holistic view of the object. When anger is arising, to remember to practice patience, and so on, because that will tamp down that particular instance of the arising of that particular mental state, that particular negative mental state. But fundamentally, what Buddhists are trying to do is overcome fundamental ignorance, because then all of the negative mental states that flow from fundamental ignorance are completely eradicated all at once. It's like chopping down the tree rather than removing one branch at a time, when there's hundreds or thousands of branches, but there's only one, base to the tree.
Can I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
So for attachment, the antidote is see the big picture. Is that what you just said?
I mean, there can be a number. I mean, ultimately, you could think about the disadvantages of attachment.
Right.
That might help, but ultimately, you want to recognize that you're exaggerating one particular aspect of the
Right.
object, and that there's other aspects, and not all of them are pleasant. Nothing. The mind of attachment acts as if the object is entirely pleasant, is made out of happiness, is in the nature of happiness. And that's a mistaken view that's exaggerating just one part of it. So also recollecting that there's other parts will help us to, still be in relation to that object, but to do it in a balanced way.
Right. And then for anger, it's patience. And diluted pride, the antidote.
For diluted pride, often they would say that the most immediate antidote would be to try to recollect all of the things that one does not know or cannot do. So basically, in a way, humility, because we've
Okay.
started, with thinking about, oh, I'm really good with, math, and because I'm really, or I'm an accomplished violinist or whatever. And so then that may be true, but are you also an astrophysicist? Can you also fly a plane? Do you understand? And they also say to think about the spiritual topics. Have I understood impermanence? Have I understood, all of the spiritual topics as well? But even just thinking about the thousands of things that other people are good at, be like, yeah, okay, it's true that I'm good at this one thing, but these other 10,000 things I can't do at all, and if a, you know, if a plane is crashing, the only thing that matters is can you fly the plane, and so that the pilot becomes really important. They just saved your life because of their skill. You know, so it's just kind of recognizing that, you know, sure, you have a skill, and in a particular context that skill might have some utility, but it only has utility in that one specific context that really has no meaning.
Yeah. So then envy, it's develop a joyful mind. And for fundamental ignorance, it's get enlightened.
Yeah, I mean, they would say wisdom, you know, wisdom
Wisdom.
is the, so the mind that understands the nature of reality, the mind that understands how things actually do exist. So, and it's too big of a topic for us to really go into, but we do go into it a bit more in Discovering Buddhism, particularly in the last class of Discovering, I'm sorry, of Buddhism in a Nutshell. Also, Discovering Buddhism has a whole module on it, but I meant next month in Buddhism in a Nutshell, the last class is kind of devoted to that topic. But it's too, we don't have, it takes about an hour to talk about it in any kind of reasonable way. But we're out of time, unfortunately, for today. As we did, we set a positive motivation to begin. So we'll finish with dedication. So we just think that having set that positive motivation, we tried to follow through on it by looking for those tools, those techniques, those ideas to put into practice. And that process of putting that motivation into practice created positive energy in the mind. And now we want to direct that positive energy in a useful direction. So we think, may that energy ripen in whatever way is truly beneficial for sentient beings. So try to cultivate a sense of giving away one's effort, giving away one's activity, giving it away for the benefit of others. Thinking, may it ripen in whatever way sentient beings need. May it help them progress along the path. May it ripen their minds. May it protect them from suffering. We can think about those who are suffering in the hurricane. Think, may whatever they need be fulfilled, whatever will lessen their suffering. You can think of those who passed away in the hurricane, those that are in the intermediate state, and think, may they achieve a positive rebirth, quickly meet a perfect teacher, and achieve the state of enlightenment. And also think, may I achieve that state of enlightenment so that I will be of perfect benefit to sentient beings. So just think along those lines and offer your practice. All right. Well, thanks for coming. We've reached the end of this class. We do it every other month also, so with different teachers, but I had fun. So have a good night.
Thank you, Venerable. Good night.